It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody. My name is Brian Wilson. Welcome to Pure Performance, and today we have an especially exciting show. Andy, do you know why it's an especially exciting show? I'm putting you on the spot here.
Why? Yeah, I know. So I know we have a guest today who currently lives in a country that managed to Brexit twice in the last couple of days. We have to tell the audience we're recording now on the 29th of June, and the country that I'm talking about is obviously England, and they tried to escape the... That's not the exciting thing?
No, that is exciting, but the exciting thing is this is episode number 10.
I'm sorry. I think the Brexit and the shame of Iceland against England is so clear in my head still that I thought this is the most exciting thing. I'm sorry. Yeah, episode 10 is very good.
Yes, so 10th. What's the 10th anniversary? I don't know. That'd be someone can let us know. I know, when you're talking about marriage, there's like paper anniversary and all these kind of like cardboard, all these kind of weird things. I think diamond is like 50 or something, but you don't get the diamond for a long time. But so we're at number 10. I'm actually not upset about Iceland because I'm not Icelandic, but I have a little bit of Norwegian in me, so that puts me sort of in that geographical region for my heritage. So that's kind of I heard like 30% of the country of Iceland was in the UK for that game with the team and the fans.
Well, not in the UK and France, because the Euro event that you just disqualified yourself as a soccer lover or as a football lover, as we call it.
Well, I was going to say, calling it soccer disqualifies yourself too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, Andy, you were. So you were, and again, as people know, we record these ahead of time, and so you just got back from Velocity, right? Tell us a couple of things about that.
So I think the most interesting, it's very interesting to just talk with a lot of people, meet Steve Souders. I actually got Steve Souders on a short interview that you can also listen to on our podcast. And I think with this interview, we actually launched a new, let's say, special feature, which we call the Pure Performance Cafe. So I had Steve on the line. It was his, it's been 9 years of Velocity. And I think the most controversial session was the session from Tammy Everts and Pat Meenan, who showed their results on a study that they did. They created a machine learning, they did some machine learning and basically put real user monitoring data through the machine learning engine and try to figure out which measures and which metrics actually best correlate to user experience and actually conversion rate and bounce rate. And the most surprising result was that render time, which we believed in the last couple of years to be most important, was actually not correlating at all and was actually very on the bottom of the list. But they also claimed, they say, well, this is just, our set of data that we used, and you need to use it on your own set of data, because every page is different. But that was very interesting. Then another thing that I really loved was the session from Adam Auerbach, who did a session on how Capital One transformed their traditional pipeline into real continuous deployment. They're deploying multiple times a day now, which is very interesting, especially for a financial company.
And with the render one, and all of those are available on Pure Performance Cafe. They were released in June, so go back and check them out. They're all under 10 minutes, so they're great quick hits. But for the render time one, besides the fact that we track render time, which is kind of funny now, although this isn't the end of render time, I don't think, as they said. Did they have another metric that they, what did they say from their study was like the number one, or did they have that?
It was DOM load time, which obviously makes sense. But for me, DOM load time is also very closely related to rendering. But yeah, they had a list of the top metrics, and DOM load was, I think, the number one that they had. And then also they correlated the number of elements on the page, how complex it is. But definitely DOM load time was the number one. Wow. Everybody was just shocked about rendering because we tried to optimize rendering in the last couple of years, and now they're telling us it's it's not that relevant. But as you said, and as they also said, not every page is equal, so you need to do your own testing. It was just interesting that they used machine learning to figure out which metrics are most relevant to optimize to get a better conversion rate and better, more revenue on an e-commerce side, for instance. That was very interesting. Yeah, and other than that, I also wrote a little blog, just an FYI, meeting minutes from Velocity. So if you go to blog.dynatrace.com and search for Velocity 2016, you'll find that.
That's apmblogs.dynatrace.com now, though, actually.
Yeah, I think it redirects, though. It's something that's called, it's something, yeah, I hope so. I think so.
It used to be that one, I know, a long time ago. So speaking of Brexit, would you like to introduce our expat guest?
Yeah, well, we will see what really happens if the Brexit really happens, and what that means actually for our honored guest, Matt. I'll try to pronounce the name as I would do when I would be in Austria or Germany. Eisengruber. Even though I know probably it's more like Eisengruber or Gruber. I don't know how do Americans correctly pronounce it. I call him Matt Eisengruber. And he's one of our fellow colleagues who made the jump over the pond from the US to England and is now helping our clients, the Dynatrace clients, to better leverage Dynatrace as a guardian. And Matt, we met a couple of weeks ago in London at one of our Perform Day events, and you approached me and you said, "Hey, I think I have some good stories for the podcast." And I think one of these stories was really, really interesting because we will explain that story in a second and give us the intro. But I thought that was so great that we could not only help people to make better decisions on performance, but also impact their personal lives in a positive way. So Matt, without further ado, who are you? Give a quick intro and then introduce us.
Why do we care about you? Yeah.
Exactly. Why should we care? Why should we listen?
Well, Andy, cheers for that. Appreciate it. And probably I'll start with the Perform when I met you in London there. Probably one of the most interesting topics I thought you had that was a little bit underplayed, but it was great, was around the technical debt. And I noticed in previous podcasts you guys talked about business debt as well. I think those are two vastly undiscovered capabilities of the product. But myself, I came from a small town out of Sebring, Michigan, which was mostly agricultural based. So my performance metrics as a kid were based around the number of cattle I had to feed, how many acres of land you had, and the bushels you'd get per acre on whatever crop you were growing. So
you sound like
quite a bit different.
You sound like you're running for office.
Exactly. Well, yeah. So jumped over the pond, and life's quite a bit different now as we get into some of this stuff. But yeah, what I wanted to talk about today was around the automation. Because what I tend to see out in the field is we have great tools, great capabilities, but we have reporting from, I don't know, it seems like from 1980 still. A lot of Excel sheets still floating around that people use. And I think it's very difficult to show any kind of improvement week over week, or if you're looking to get into the DevOps culture where you're releasing things every 10 minutes. To have to do an Excel sheet to prove those results, I don't think is very feasible anymore. So the story I had was from a client 2 years ago. They had just bought Atmon. She was a QA analyst, and she was looking to, she had to do a report. So every time development would run a load test, she would have to do the analysis on it. And she was doing it in Excel, and they were using LoadRunner at the time as well. So they hadn't integrated anything with Atmon yet. They had just installed the agents, but hadn't really looked at its capabilities. They loved the transaction flow, and that was about it. So what I noticed was day after day, because they'd run a test, I think it was twice a week, and the next day, so they'd run the test at night, she'd come in the morning, and she'd just, facing the screen from 8 a.m., and it would be 6, 7 at night before she'd leave. And I noticed that the stress just kept building and building with her. And so finally I asked her, I said, "What are you doing?" She goes, I got to run this report every day. I said, "Well, how long does it take you?" And she goes, about 8 hours on average. So that threw up some red flags to me, just like it would if it was inside a tool and you hit a threshold, right? I mean, 8 hours to do a report, it was mind-numbing to me. So I sat down with her, and we took the simplification approach. So I looked at what she was trying to do with LoadRunner, first of all. And what we did is we added some Dynatrace tags in so that when the LoadRunner scripts would run, we had properly labeled things coming into Dynatrace so we could get some good sessions, some good peer path data. And then I looked at her actual report that she was trying to get out of it, and she had like all these tabs in Excel, and it was quite a monster, to be honest. Very manual, very time consuming. So what we did is I sat down and I took each section of that Excel sheet and we converted it into a dashlet inside Dynatrace. And as the dashlet's all filled out, we ended up fitting it on one dashboard that we made look really nice in a report. And then we took it one step further and looked into the REST interface. And because the whole idea was I wanted to automate this whole report process for her so that she could go, well, one, so she could start making it to her kids' soccer games. And sorry, Andy, you're European, so football games that she was missing that night. And then two, I wanted her to get back to being able to be an analyst, not a report generator. Because like I said, we got tools that can do that. So started looking into the REST interface. And what I found was, well, something from 1970, because we actually make some REST interface calls using epic time, which I thought was pretty neat. So I had to learn a little bit about epic time first to do the calculation correctly. But how we ended up, our finished product was you'd start off, the LoadRunner test would kick off, and it would make a call to the REST interface of the Dynatrace server to start a save session. And then at the end of the test, it would run a stop call so that it would save all the sessions into its separate test folder inside the Dynatrace server. And then it would also generate that report and automatically send her an email. So essentially, we took what was taking her 8 hours to now she walked into work the day after a test, and that morning she would open it up and the results were right there for her. And then if those results showed anything, if any thresholds were breached, she could then refer to the save session that we had set up and send that to development, who also had Dynatrace, obviously, and they could talk the same language. So some of the knock-on effects to that was she had a great, all of a sudden she got her life back, and it was great.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's a phenomenal. It's been 2 years ago, as you say, but I still see a lot of people, still creating these reports and then not even knowing who is actually looking at the reports. So hopefully somebody's looking at the reports, but you basically optimized a full workday. And then actually, I think a lot of people, and this would be an interesting question to you back now. So was she fearing in the end? I mean, obviously she got the time back. That's great. But was she kind of fearing that her job was optimized away, or did she see this as an opportunity to actually do more with her time and actually really going into the data analytics part?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. And that fear was non-existent in her. Actually, she was crying and gave me a hug once we got it all done because she went into that soccer game that night. But no, what she ended up doing then was, instead of spending all that time reporting, because they were on a very tight deadline, because this was a project that was rolling out. It needed to roll out. It had already hit. They had ran into some issues with a third-party provider, so they were behind schedule. They weren't meeting the performance marks that they needed to. So the project was stalling, and she was, at the time, a bottleneck for that, because until she could deliver that report back to development, they couldn't go the next round. So she was actually slowing down the release cycles. So in this case, by removing that bit from the bottleneck, it didn't cause her any harm. In fact, she loved it, because then she started doing it for other things as well, and just became a better analyst, because she actually had the time and instead of doing the mind-numbing work of making sure she's double-checking and verifying all their figures, she's now actually doing an analyst job of looking through the data and finding the harder things to get.
That's perfect. So she really leveled up, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
I guess also giving the whole thing a little more thought on what is actually on the report, because my question would be, the report that she generated, I'm sure she has done this for a while, and this is kind of a standard report. Did she ever question what is on the report and if the report still makes sense, or did she then also try to level it up and besides just generating graphs, actually coming up with recommendations and solutions?
Right. Well, and that was the interesting bit, was that just like you said, we found some, I don't know if this would be a good use case for technical debt in that report, but there was definitely some functionality that was removed like I said, we simplified it, and it was the fact that because we broke it down and compartmentalized it into each section, and each dashlet had to represent a section, she therefore had to pick and choose what was the most important thing she wanted to get across in that message. And we had to rethink thresholds and values, and really take a deep look and spend the time making that template for that, so that it worked out. So yeah, she definitely leveled up both her skills, because she had to go back and review and what are we trying to accomplish. And I think it kind of took her out of her job and expanded it out. Like you guys talk about, bridging the gap between the teams, and how we're all in it together. And I think doing that exercise with her made her realize that, the bigger picture was they needed to get a product shipped out the door. And she was, she can help them better by doing it in this way.
Yeah, this reminds me of my old, I used to be performance guy, right? And again, I used LoadRunner, and I will not hide at all my disdain for the reporting in that. I used to spend, I don't think I ever spent 4 or 8 hours generating a report, because at a certain point I got it down to a way to, I had my own spreadsheet that I had set up for data. I could then export the reports from the analysis tool, copy the data in, plug it in, have it, the macros on the spreadsheet would then start putting in the other calculations. But that was always such a real pain in the butt, and I'd only been using Dynatrace for about 1.5 years, close to 2 years before I left that company and went to work with Dynatrace. But it was still the kind of situation where, this I think was before Dynatrace had so many of the ES enablement people on board, but there was also just not the time to try to set up that interface like you did with her. But what I found was really interesting with reporting, and you kind of touched on it there, is modifying and changing what you report on. As time went on, like I would have these very complex reports, comparing all different types of data. And for maybe the development team, and maybe for our own team of analyzing and understanding and trying to get a feel of whether or not this release was acceptable, that data was good. But whenever then I'd get called into a meeting with the CTO and some of the other VPs, VP development and all that, they would look at this spreadsheet and be like, what the hell is this? Because it was just way too much data, way all over the place. And we then had to figure out, all right, we have a detailed report. Now how do I reduce the amount of metrics that I'm reporting on to something more C-level friendly? And I just bring that up because I think it's so much easier when you're using a tool like Dynatrace with the different charts, graphs that you can put in there. Besides having the individual transactions, you could very easily look at the overall transactions, and there's just a lot of different ways you can very easily and very in a visually pleasing sort of way put that data out, so that when you do take it to that C-level team, they're kind of looking for the red light, green light, and if it's red light, you need to have some of those indicators of why it's a red light. And I think it just makes it a lot easier when you have one of these reports. You can, as you might say, just get all the data and pop that baby in there. And I have to admit, that was a Rick Boyd asked me to say that during this at some point.
Yeah. Oh, that's another story, I think, Brian.
So Matt, do you remember what type of metrics and data they had on that report? Maybe because our listeners, they might be interested in, so what are others doing? What are other companies doing when they analyze the load tests? And maybe what did they have up there? What was the initial requirement? But what did you end up delivering after you figured out, hey, maybe not all of the data is actually necessary, but because we now have APM tools, we can actually provide much better, more actionable data. Do you remember some tips and tricks?
Yeah, so some of the things that we did was, or some of the questions I asked, it was more kind of an asking session from her is what I did. And I sat down with some of the developers, and anything that was a known issue, right? So anything like they knew that they were struggling with some database queries, specific ones. And so they needed to know invocation count and then response time, right? So you can, and I know you guys talk about the N+1 problem and string concatenations and all that. So, but that was the big thing for them was they were worried about the number of invocations they were making. It was quite a complex program. And then they were also trying to relate that back to, response time overall. So tying that together. And then there was a few other things. They were worried about geography, because this application at the time was going to be deployed. It was going to be a U.S. deployment first, and then it was going to go international quite quickly after that. And so they needed to make sure that they factored in latency. So there's a bit of modeling that they were looking to get out of that for their load. So that was it, really. But it was just working from past experience. And I think actually, as we got through it, we made a version 1 of that report, if you will. And then I waited a couple of weeks, let the team feedback and stuff, and then obviously more questions came out of that, because as you turn the lights on for the people and begin to show them the visibility that they can have, I think that it kind of dawns on them that, I can start asking for more, right? So until you show them, they don't know what to ask for, type thing. And as they got more intelligent in reading the reports, they began to ask more intelligent questions, and then we actually created a feedback loop where, okay, Matt, maybe we were showing top N queries, but can we show top N invocation counts as well, and can we show things that are maybe use this specific select statement because we think that there may be something going on there, but we're not sure. And so we kept adjusting that report, and it wasn't the same report by the end. I mean, by the time we hit the final version and the project rolled on and it was a success, it had changed quite a bit, but it wasn't that it was moving goalposts. We still had some of the concrete data, but then it was all the little stuff around it that helped, the tweaks to that report made it all the more valuable as we continued.
Yeah, it really sounds like the kind of report that you can add in a lot of the metrics we've talked about in past shows. Obviously, don't try to boil the ocean at once, but once you start getting all that buy-in, adding things in like total number of queries over the course of the session, average number of queries per transaction, number of threads, all the kind of, I want to say new performance metrics, but they're not really new, but I think kind of new in the fact of is the performance team looking beyond CPU and response time?
Well, especially new if these are, let's say, the load testing people, and whether it's LoadRunner or JMeter or any other tools, but they, as you said, they typically look at response time, and what we can bring to the table, people need to understand, especially with the integration that we provide for load testing tools, so we can actually get the load testing step name or the transaction name, and then tell them, hey, in this particular test for the login transaction, you have on average 500 database queries. You're consuming that amount of CPU on average. You have 700 exceptions that are typically thrown. And by the way, here are your top exceptions, your top SQL statements. Here you have the N+1 query problem. And by the way, why do you execute every single database statement on a single connection? So you can put all of this on a nice dashboard. And it seems, Matt, that you've done this, and then the more people see what's possible, the more they're asking. I think I like that a lot. So kind of leveling up the whole team. So it started leveling up this lady who, instead of just creating, quote unquote, a stupid report that nobody really knew what it is, then she could actually really deliver answers and actually get people to ask questions about what else they needed to know. And I think that's awesome, because in the end, everybody was leveled up, and they could do more. They could get more answers in shorter time because everything was automated, thanks to things like the REST API that we provide, or thanks to the dashboarding technology that we provide. I love that. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
And did they? You mentioned Dev having Dynatrace. Did they actually have it in their environment, or they just had the client?
They had the client. So
okay.
So what she would do then is the meeting changed, right? So instead of her emailing out the Excel sheet, they'd sit down for a few hours because it'd take a while to go through all the different tabs and that. It was, okay, we have a single, I don't want to say single pane of glass because that's an overused term, but we have a single view of the truth that we're all going to agree on that it's the truth. And then she could go in there, and then when she would get asked the question, because I think that's the next thing is when you switch your reporting style, a lot of people don't feel comfortable, right, because they don't feel confident in representing the data. But she could just revert back to the save session then. And so then she could share that save session file with the developers, have them open it up on the screen in the big conference room, and they would go through it and begin to look at the peer paths and the methods and the API and the response time hotspots and all the good things that Dynatrace does. So it actually resulted in a greater adoption of the tool in general, and an adoption of the culture of we're all going to realize that a change has been made, and it's for the better, and we're going to embrace this. And the results of those meetings were far more substantial than before.
And I think you brought up an interesting point about the new metrics being accepted, right? I went through that myself as well back in my old job when we started switching over to different ways of looking at the data. And oftentimes once you have more information, like what you can get out of an APM tool, or even some of the traditional statistics, when you're taking a look, if I run 3 test runs on a build, instead of reporting the individual instances, every test is going to have some slight variability, switching over to showing what's the average response change of the 3 tests, the average delta versus the average delta of the previous test. No matter what you do, when you start trying to switch up metrics, there becomes that uncomfortability, or that becomes uncomfortable for everybody, because there have been so many decisions on the past made from your old set of metrics, whether or not they were good or bad. That was the standard. And a lot of that buy-in then for the new set of metrics is exactly how you were describing that. The dev teams were presented with them, and they agreed, yes, these are the more important ones, and they were able to then move forward with the new set without much of a hiccup, because it was a technical buy-in from all the teams that this is an overall improvement, and these are much more important and meaningful metrics.
Right. And I think it's important to also adopt a common language, because I think traditionally it was infrastructure-based metrics, if I will. So your CPU, your memory, it was all capacity-based metrics, I guess you could say. Whereas the new age metrics, I suppose we could call it, would be more interactive, right? It's the interaction between the layers that we care about now, not so much the layer itself, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think it was people didn't have access to it. Like you said, before the APM tool sets came in, all we had was Windows Task Manager or Linux Top. You know what I mean? And then that slowly evolved into, okay, now we're looking at how things are interacting and measuring the complexity instead of looking at the silo. And that was a big step.
Yeah. The other thing I was, the reason I asked if the dev team was just had the client, or if they had if they actually had Dynatrace in the dev environment, is because obviously then in a place where it's possible, the obvious next step would be to get those same metrics being tracked and reported on from the dev team. Now, that wasn't the case in this case, as you mentioned, but if anyone out there is in a situation where in their test team they have Dynatrace, in their dev team they have Dynatrace, this is where you start getting, what did you say, the common language, but you start tracking all those metrics early on and track it in the dev phase, so that there's a real good chance they'll start noticing those smaller changes without load, that they can go back and say, hey, this isn't going to fly once we put it in performance, so we'll fix it now before we even send it on to the next level.
Yeah, maybe this was also 2 years. 2 years ago, we didn't really have the free trial yet. And I think this is the free trial that we provide, and then the personal license, which basically means Dynatrace for free for every developer or for testers and architects on the local machines. I think that is actually now enabling these teams to actually do these checks early on. I think my big thing that I always try to say now in my presentations is we want to enable developers to even don't check in bad code, right? Don't even check it in if you can already verify that a code change may impact the number of database queries that your code is going to execute later on. So finding more of these problems early on, so to give that lady that you were talking about even better test results, because now she can actually run the tests and analyze tests and really find the tricky problems. So I think that it's a level up across the whole life cycle in the end. Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's cool too, because once the dev and test teams start working together on that for some time, they're going to be able to understand, okay, if a transaction is run, X amount of times per minute, and based on what we've seen in the past, when the dev team increased the queries maybe by 3 additional queries, what was the impact on that under load, right? And you start to get those sort of models figured out, so that even I don't know if 3 queries in general, that's not a very large increase, obviously depending on the query and the payload and all. But you start getting an understanding from both the test team and the development team. Three queries under X amount of transactions per second for the ones that call that. What impact is that going to have under load? And the developers can have a much more finessed view of what those minor changes are going to have. Obviously, if they went from 3 queries to 100 queries, that's very obvious, right? Everyone's going to know that's going to be bad. But when you have those more finessed ones, you'll start developing a model over time to understand the impact that these smaller ones will have in conjunction with the amount of the transaction rate that it's running. So over time, that team would become, just stellar.
Yeah, and they become more of behavioral analysts than, system analysts, if you will. It kind of switches their skill set because they evolve.
Right.
So what I would like to kind of conclude that topic, and I would like to talk a little bit about the future, meaning, how can we make it even easier? But before we switch into that topic, Brian, I think you have, do we have another trivia question actually for our listeners? Is that time before we move on to what's coming up next?
Well, yes, but wait, do you hear that noise? That is the trivia time. So we missed last week's trivia. I thought really hard about getting one and phrasing it in a way that won't make it too easily Googleable, or Bingable, sorry, Andy. But so the trivia question for today, based on this episode airing on in early August, what day did I say that was going to be? I think the 19th-ish? No, 16th, I think. Back 36 years ago, on August 17th, a really, really great movie, 80s comedy called Real Genius premiered. It starred Val Kilmer and a bunch of other people, and this was before Val Kilmer became Jim Morrison and became a real stuck-up and just egotistical bastard. Hilarious movie. It's a great 80s movie. And it features a bunch of characters who, just really loved experimenting and learning. These were super, back in the day, these were the stereotypical nerds who, most of them, except for Val Kilmer's character, of course, were not very well adjusted to operating in real society because they were just too smart. Today they would probably be Silicon Valley darlings and millionaires. Anyway, the great movie, go see it, definitely recommend it. But the question about this movie, then, Real Genius, if you have seen it, is what does Real Genius have in common with Napoleon? So if you know the answer to that, you can tweet it back at hashtag pure performance, or hashtag pure performance at Dynatrace, or hashtag pure performance, hashtag no prize, KNOWPRIZE. Just get it back to us, or you can email your answer to pureperformance@dynatrace.com, and your name will be featured on our website as being a real genius yourself. So with that, let's talk about the future.
Yeah. So here's one thing that mind boggles me all the time. And Matt and Brian, I'm sure you've seen this the same way. We run into the same problems all the time, right? Meaning the apps that we see, the apps that we test, the apps that we monitor in production, it's always the same problems. And we've been talking about this, right? All the metrics that we look at, whether it's the N+1 query problem that we detect by looking at the number of SQL statements that are executed per transaction or others. So now, looking at the story, Matt, that you told with this lady, she's a lady that is analyzing load tests, and maybe she doesn't have all the details about what is Hibernate and what is Spring and what is this new cool cloud technology that my developers are now using. So she's probably not aware of all the potential problem patterns that are out there. Yet, she has to provide meaningful answers on the load tests. So now my problem that I have with this is with the ever-growing set of tools and frameworks and technologies and the ever-growing problem patterns, how can we make more people performance experts and actually experts in these problem detections without having Matt all the time sitting there and telling them what to look for? So my question is, how can we scale? And the trend that I'm seeing, and this is also the trend that we've been doing at Dynatrace, is we try to automatically detect all these problems so that people like performance analysts don't have to create a dashboard that puts 3 charts next to each other and then correlate time-wise or however they correlate to figure out what the problem is. But I think a big future trend is that we really automatically detect the most common problem issues. And I wrote a blog about this on June 13th. So if you go to APM blog, dynatrace.com, there's a blog about automatic problem detection with Dynatrace, actually highlighting all of the problem patterns that we've seen or I've seen in the last couple of years. I'm sure there's many more out there. But what we're doing now, we're actually automatically tagging pure paths and transactions that we record, for instance, during a load test and say, hey, these 50% of the pure paths that go into that particular URL that came in from that particular test struggle with the N+1 query problem. Or there's too many threads involved. There's too many tiers involved. Matt, you said it's no longer necessarily about looking at individual tiers or applications, but you also look at the communication between tiers, how microservices are talking with each other. So these are all problem patterns that we need that now we automatically detect. And I think this is the future. So not only giving data, because we are, and I think Brian, you mentioned that in the beginning, we are kind of drowning in a sea of data, but it's hard to actually make sense of it. So our contribution is to automatically detect problems and also anomalies. This is stuff that Ruxit has been really good in and was built on, that we analyze the data for you, and instead of you having to do it manually, we just bubble it up. We bubble it up and we tell you if there is an impact, where is the impact. So I know this was a long statement and more a monologue that I wanted to do, but I think this is the future, the way I see it. And now my question to you guys is, what else can we do besides, or are there any other problem patterns that we need to add to the list that we currently do detect, or any other ideas on how we can scale and make more people performance experts and architectural experts? What else is out there that we can do?
Well, one thing that comes to my mind that shouldn't have to come to my mind but still happens is as far as a problem pattern, and I don't know if this is achievable, but be one to look into, is being able to tell somebody your logging is too verbose. Right? A lot of times, at least in my old past, we would get builds. Even there was once or twice that it escaped everybody and it went to production where logging was turned on debug. There's some of these what you might call silly problems that unfortunately still exist. Hopefully, with the advent of containers and the more automated one type of setting for all environments kind of thing will help get rid of that. But I guess you can have, if you build your container with logging on, you can still have that issue. But that's the only one that jumps out of my mind, being put on the spot right now. So.
Matt, what else do you do, or how? I mean, coming back to the story that you had where she was sending these reports and maybe somebody looked at it or not, how do you educate the receivers of these reports that times have changed? It's no longer about these automatically, or no longer about these reports that contain whatever data, but it's more about detecting, I think, regressions, right? That's what it is. We detect regressions from build to build, from deployment to deployment. But I mean, you said in your work, you basically gave different data to the developers, and then they asked questions. Did you also see something not only from a development side, but maybe from an architectural side, from the architects or the business people or the C-level people, that they also started looking at this performance data from a different perspective than they used to?
Yeah, most definitely. It was actually the project manager who I think began to realize that the conversations were changing. At first, obviously, he had some skepticism around some of the technicality that we had to work through. But yeah, it was, and I think a lot of the times people lose sight of what the report's there for in the beginning. Like you said, regression. But if we take it up a level higher than that and say, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to deploy something that is scalable, something that reacts well, and overall just gives a good customer experience. And if people keep that in the back of their head when they're making these reports, or when the development asks, what's the next thing to be doing, what should we be improving? Well, you improve the things that is going to give that good customer satisfaction. And that I think is sometimes lost when you get into the churn of reporting and testing, is you get too analytical and you forget about the soft science of it, that we're doing this for people on the other side of it. And just like I was able to save her loads of time on reporting, they're saving people loads of time on whatever that application function is, because that's why we use technology after all, is to make our lives easier. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that philosophicalness of it.
Yeah, I was going to say the one other thing that I think people should really start looking into more as well. You have your Matt had that great dashboard sending out the report for that current test result. But I think it's also behooves everybody who has a tool that can do what we do, which is the regression analysis, where you can take your previous build and run a regression against the current build, and it'll show you what's changed. You can compare the database, API calls, all these different kind of metrics directly out of the box. You just say, here's my source, here's my comparison. Show me all the differences, what got better, what got worse, what got introduced, what got deprecated. And I think maybe the next level on that side would be, if there were a way, would be, so just number one, that's a very important tool to use, right? Because you don't want to just, run a performance test and say, yes, it passes. It's got to be looked at in comparison with the history of the product as well. So if it's a brand new product, obviously you have nothing to compare it with. But if it's been around, yes, everything looks good, but what did it look like before? And now that you have all these other metrics, what are those changes there? I think it would be really interesting to see a way to make a, you were talking about this automation of the reporting, automation of telling people what their problems are. As you're mentioning, I think it's going to be in 6.5, Dynatrace 6.5, which I think will be in probably should be in early access by the time this airs, correct?
Exactly. It should be early access and also part of the free trial. Yeah.
Right. But I think the next step then would be, with this regression comparison concept, is a regression hotspots report. Because if you take a look at any kind of regression dashboard, once again, there's a sea of data. There's a whole bunch of things, and it comes down to looking at, all right, sorting by time, and okay, this is a 500% increase, but maybe that 500% increase was from, 220 milliseconds, or maybe 20 milliseconds to, I guess not 500%, but if it went from 20 milliseconds to 25 milliseconds, that's a significant statistical increase, but maybe not necessarily a performance concerning increase. I think from that future of automation kind of point of view would be, how do we bubble up and show the hotspots of regression?
Yeah. And actually, if you think about the problem patterns that we detect, so for instance, we detect, and let's take the all-time favorite, the N+1 query problem. So if you can run a load test, and then we can tell the user, hey, this load test has 20% more transactions that suffer from the N+1 query problem. Even if it doesn't have a performance impact right now, it's still, this is a big hotspot. And especially now in scalable architectures, I think looking at regressions based on problem patterns actually becomes more interesting than ever before, because these problem patterns tell you whether the system will be able to scale later on, and not only scale, but also if you can run it efficient. Because if you know that, now you have 20% more transactions with the N+1 query problem, it means that in operations later on, somebody needs to pay the bill for the additional transactions that you execute against your database, whether the database is hosted in-house and you need to pay licenses for the database system, or whether you run it in the cloud and you need to pay transactional fees for every single transaction you execute. So I think this is going to be very interesting to look at these patterns and how from build to build, whether you test it with load testing or even production, how the number of patterns that are included in your app change from build to build to build. I think I like that. That would be an interesting approach.
And I think it's also a good point you were talking about how it can increase now, but you don't know that effect. But on some of these cloud services, I know they charge for like the amount of data transferred from a box, for instance, or you know what I mean, like those type of. So if you're looking at, you're introducing a statement that causes 20% more throughput, well, that may have just driven your overall business cost of that application to go up, and to convert it, take it from the technical metric and be able to convert it into a business problem case. So if this is a cloud deployed app, your response time, just went up. Well, that may not be as big of a deal to them, but if their cost goes up, that's a directly, they're paying the bill every month, and they're going, oh, there we go.
And how cool would it be if you could input all of your charges and all the costs for different resources within the systems, and at the end of your test, it tells you how much more it's going to cost automatically? That would be something really awesome.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We could,
you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Yeah, and we could do this through our automation features, right? I mean, even though it might not be directly now built into Dynatrace, but you can just take the REST API, pull out the data after the tests, and then do the math, and then just publish this somewhere in a report, an automatic report, and say, hey, the cost just went up by $2,000 or something like that. Yeah, I like
really
that.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, we are at about the end of the show. Any final thoughts from anybody here?
Yeah, just wanted to say I'd like to send out a challenge to all our listeners. For those of you that have the APM tools, take a bottom-up approach once. Take a look around at the people that you work with. See if you got anybody burying their head in the screen, and see if you can make their day better. I guarantee it'll be really rewarding for you if you do.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear what your favorite reports are, your favorite metrics to include on those reports are, and if you have any great stories of a transformation like Matt, we'd love to have you on as a guest to discuss it. You can contact us through Twitter, just Twitter hashtag #pureperformance@Dynatrace, and we'll get that, or you can email pureperformance@dynatrace.com. But we'd love to hear your stories or any kind of favorite metrics, dashboards, reports, and anything you might have done in that case, to Matt's point. And I believe, what is it? The free trial is bit.ly, right? bit.ly/ what is it, Andy?
The DT personal, I think that's the personal license, or that's the easiest way. Then you can fill out the form, and you will get not only the free trial, obviously, but on that same page, you also get the information about why we actually give it away for free as a personal license. So bit.ly/DT personal, that will be the best way to sign up.
Okay, and the Pure Performance webpage, you could either find us on Spreaker by looking at Pure Performance, and I'll do this website in the early 2000s style. You can find it on the World Wide Web at http://www.dynatrace.com/pureperformance. Andy, did you have any final thoughts?
Well, the only final thought that I have is thanks for the first 10 episodes.
Yes.
And an apology that I didn't get the hint in the beginning of the session, that I just thought about Brexit, but not about the 10th episode. And I'm just very happy, Matt, that people like you just share the stories, because in that way we can scale. So what I wanted to say earlier, how can we make more people aware of performance and make them more performance experts? And I think sharing stories is just the way. And thanks to the World Wide Web, we can record things like this and then make it available and accessible to a larger audience. So thanks for that.
Thank you, everybody. And will there be any appearances by any of you sometime near after August 16th that you're aware of?
Well, I will appear at the DevOps Days in Boston. That's been confirmed.
Yay.
I've also heard that I will be speaking at Java 1. That's going to be nice. I'm still waiting for DevOps Chicago, which hopefully they will also accept me. I think that's about it.
And I want to congratulate you on saying Java 1 and not Java 1. Although I think that's Mr. Kopp's big
Java.
speaking.
Yeah.
All right. unless there's anything else, I'm all set here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for 10 episodes, and don't forget the Pure Performance Cafe. We should hopefully have some more of those out there by this time. But nice, quick, short hits for the shorter commutes. But thanks again it's a great opportunity that we're getting to do this, and we're having a lot of fun. So thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.